The first time he cried was when he was denied meeting his white farm friend, despite the fact that his heart was revealed when the white uniformed owner of a shoe store, despite the store being empty, made him wait for the purchase. Then he faced a third setback when he was denied sitting on the next available seat on the bus because only white uniforms were allowed to sit there. His heart bled at this injustice, but then he had a dream so significant that he had to sacrifice his own life to interpret its meaning. Who was he? In today's series, we are presenting the story of American civil rights hero Martin Luther King. On December 1, 1955, in Montgomery, the capital of the U.S. state of Alabama, a black woman named Rosa Parks boarded a bus. After a while, when a white uniform came on the bus, the driver told Rosa to vacate her seat for him. Rosa refused, and the driver reported her to the police. However, this incident made black community leaders feel that it was time not to fear but to fight for their rights. One of these leaders, Martin Luther King, was a church employee in Montgomery, Georgia. He had also faced several encounters with injustice in the past. He appealed to black communities to boycott buses. The black community followed suit, and instead of sitting in buses, they started walking. Martin was arrested due to this boycott, but he did not give up his struggle. The boycott lasted a year, but Martin succeeded in breaking the transportation segregation, and they achieved victory. They were prepared to ensure that no white person would force any black person to give up their seat on the bus. After this realization by the transporters, the boycott came to an end. Martin had his own car, but as a symbol of the victory for black people, he also boarded a bus. Martin Luther King had won his first battle against racism based on Mahatma Gandhi's principles of nonviolence, considering Gandhi as his role model. After the successful resolution of the transportation issue in Montgomery, Martin formed a civil rights group called the Southern Leadership Conference, or SCLC. With the platform of this group, Martin initiated an unending struggle for the rights of black people. In this struggle, he had to visit several American cities, where each city presented a new challenge. In Washington, D.C., near the White House, there is the Lincoln Memorial, featuring a statue of Lincoln sitting on a chair. On May 17, 1957, in front of this statue, Martin Luther King addressed thousands of people. At that time, he demanded that President Eisenhower take action to ensure equal rights for black people. Eisenhower did not heed Martin Luther King's demands, but Martin did not give up his struggle. He continued to raise his voice for the rights of black people. In 1959, he left Montgomery and moved to his hometown, Atlanta, Georgia. The headquarters of his civil rights organization were also located in this city. In Atlanta, Martin joined a student movement where black and sympathetic white students initiated a campaign. They would go to department stores and sit at counters reserved only for white patrons during lunchtime, aiming to demonstrate that segregating counters for white customers was wrong. This movement was happening in several American cities, but the police started arresting these students. On October 19, 1960, Martin was also arrested from a department store. When presented before the judge, he stated that this protest was to draw attention to racial injustice. Martin was released from jail 5 days later, but on May 4, he was arrested again on charges of driving with a false license. With his legs shackled, he was moved to a prison 200 miles away. His supporters feared it would be difficult for Martin to get out of jail, but fortunately, during those days, elections were taking place in America. Martin's supporters appealed for help from both presidential candidates, Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy. Kennedy, prepared to help Martin, was the brother of John F. Kennedy and a lawyer. He called the judge and arranged for Martin to be released on bail. Martin's release led to a majority of black people supporting John F. Kennedy in the presidential election, and after Martin's release, he resumed the lunch counter movement. Ultimately, segregation at counters for both white and black patrons was abolished in many places in America. Martin Luther King won another important battle for the rights of black people. Now, Martin chose a city where the police were willing to go to any extent to crush black people. The confrontation began in the state of Alabama's Birmingham region, where Police Commissioner Bull Connor, notorious for his racism, openly threatened demonstrators. When Martin initiated the movement in this city, at Connor's orders, the police attacked demonstrators with batons and even used dogs to scare them. About 500 people, including women, were sent to jail, and on April 6, those who marched towards City Hall also faced police dogs. During a protest, Martin was also arrested by Connor. He was taken into custody and placed in a jail cell. There was no way for light to enter the small, dimly lit room except for a small window. In the jail, Martin managed to write a letter. Since he didn't have paper, he wrote on toilet paper and the blank spaces of newspapers. In the letter, he expressed the need for people to engage in civil disobedience against unjust laws, but emphasized the necessity of being prepared to face the consequences of breaking the law. The jail in which Martin was imprisoned during the siege has been rebuilt and preserved. Martin was released from jail a week later, but police brutality continued to escalate. On one occasion, the police confiscated posters from protesting children, and even children as young as 6 years old were placed in jail for 6 years. A pivotal moment in the movement occurred on May 2 when the entire city became a battleground between the police and demonstrators. The police not only used batons on the protesters, but also unleashed high-pressure water hoses on them, similar to water cannons. The police released dogs on the demonstrators, who were tearing at the protesters' clothing. After confrontations, the protest ended, but the white-owned businesses in the city responded with patience. Black patrons had boycotted their businesses, leading to a decline in their businesses. In response, they pledged to end discriminatory practices against black customers. Despite the worst violence from the police, Martin Luther King remained committed to nonviolent struggle in Birmingham. However, with Birmingham, Martin became involved in another student movement. These students referred to themselves as Freedom Riders. They traveled on buses and, at every stop, sat in designated voting rooms reserved for white patrons as a form of protest. The white patrons retaliated by burning their buses and launching deadly attacks. Still, the students did not back down. Martin joined them one night when he participated in a Freedom Riders meeting in a church in Montgomery. An attack ensued outside the white supremacist church, and Martin and his companions, maintaining their composure, sang a song together. "We shall overcome, we shall overcome. Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday." After a brief confrontation, he calmly retreated. Now, with Martin's participation, the movement spread throughout America. However, the Freedom Riders faced extreme violence. Their bus was set on fire, and they were attacked brutally. Despite this, the students remained resilient. Martin also supported these students. One night, when he was present at a Freedom Riders meeting in Montgomery, an attack occurred. White supremacists gathered outside the church, throwing stones and bottles. Martin and his companions remained calm and sang the same song. "We shall overcome, we shall overcome. Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday." After facing the worst violence, Martin King remained a symbol of peaceful resistance in Birmingham. Yet, he had also become involved in another student movement known as the Freedom Riders. They traveled by bus, sitting in designated voting rooms reserved for white patrons at each stop as a form of protest. The police responded by using dogs and high-pressure water hoses against them. However, the students did not yield. The movement faced a significant challenge on May 11, 1963, when President Kennedy addressed Congress, calling for the passage of a civil rights or urban rights bill to end discriminatory practices against black citizens. This was a major success for the black community after years of anticipation. Martin Luther King organized a large gathering in Washington, D.C. in support of the Civil Rights Bill. On August 28, 1963, in front of the Lincoln Memorial, a sea of 100,000 Americans had assembled. Martin began his speech, but he couldn't finish it as he was suddenly interrupted by the powerful voice of Mahalia Jackson, an American gospel singer and close associate of Luther. She shouted, "Tell them about the dream." Martin Luther King paused and then, inspired by Mahalia's words, he left his prepared speech aside and spoke from the heart. He said, "I have a dream that one day the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice." He continued to share his dream of equality, justice, and brotherhood. These words became historic and represented the aspirations of every black individual who sought liberation from injustice. On that day, Martin and his colleagues visited the White House and met with President John F. Kennedy. However, tragedy struck during this time. On November 22, 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated. Despite this tragedy, the struggle for equal rights continued. The Civil Rights Act that Kennedy had sought to pass was eventually signed into law by his successor, President Lyndon B. Johnson, fulfilling the dream that Martin Luther King had articulated. On July 1964, another historic day for American civil rights occurred when President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act on the bridge. For the signing ceremony, Martin Luther King was specially invited and stood beside Johnson on the bridge. Martin had won the struggle for civil rights through peaceful activism. He was rightfully awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and with it came a prize of $54,000, which he donated to civil rights groups. Despite the passage of the Civil Rights Act, Martin Luther King did not halt his efforts. Instead, he took a new direction. In March 1965, Martin led a march with 25,000 people from Selma to the state capitol in Montgomery to advocate for voting rights for African Americans. As a result of this march, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act on August 6, 1965, eliminating discriminatory practices that had previously required African Americans to pass educational tests to vote. With the resolution of voting and civil rights issues, Martin Luther King turned his attention to the fight against poverty. He moved to Chicago, where a significant population of 1 million African Americans faced unemployment and discrimination in employment. In 1966, Martin organized several protests and marches in Chicago. During this time, he faced physical attacks from white supremacists, but he remained steadfast in his commitment. Eventually, he succeeded in pressuring the mayor to end discriminatory practices in employment against African Americans. While in Chicago, Martin relocated his family to an apartment in a poor African American neighborhood instead of a wealthier area. He took an active role in maintaining and improving his new apartment. Martin continued his struggle for civil rights, but also joined forces with boxing legend Muhammad Ali to speak out against the Vietnam War. However, Martin Luther King believed that the more significant issue in America was the eradication of poverty. He advocated for economic justice and equality, emphasizing the need to address the systemic issues that perpetuated poverty in the country. In 1968, Martin Luther King called for the allocation of $30 billion from Congress to eradicate poverty. In addition to this demand, he announced a march towards Washington to fulfill his goal, rallying his supporters. However, during this period, in the city of Memphis, Tennessee, sanitation workers staged a strike against inadequate facilities. Undeterred, King initiated his movement, known as the I Am a Man campaign. Despite facing threats of violence, he remained steadfast. On the evening of April 4th, standing on the balcony of his hotel, a sudden gunshot rang out and a bullet struck him in the neck. Martin fell, and his companions, who were standing nearby, signaled towards the assailant, creating a commotion. The assassin fled, but an hour later, Martin succumbed to his injuries in the hospital. Martin Luther King was a hero to the Black community, and news of his death sparked widespread unrest. Riots erupted, leading to the arson of buildings and looting of stores. Over 40 people lost their lives, and thousands were injured during the turmoil. To regain control, the military was deployed in cities like Washington and Chicago. In response to King's death, the U.S. government declared April 7th a day of mourning. The perpetrator of Martin Luther King's assassination was a white man named James Earl Ray. He was apprehended on June 8 at London's Heathrow Airport and later sentenced to 99 years in prison. Ray passed away in prison in 1998. Martin Luther King's coffin was brought to his hometown, Atlanta, where final rites were performed. Initially buried in Southview Cemetery in Atlanta, his remains were later moved to the King Center. Martin's widow, Coretta King, was also laid to rest at the same location. Just a 2-minute walk away, the Martin Luther King National Historic Site is situated, encompassing his childhood home and the church where he served as a pastor. In Washington, D.C., the Martin Luther King Memorial stands tall, featuring a sculpture of King carved into a granite mountain.